Okay, so we're going to start the first video. This will be the design process video for both POE and EDD. And there'll be a couple things that are a little different for each class, depending on which one you're in. So I'll make sure that I bring that out when we talk about the presentation. So our objective here is that you're going to learn how to describe a process in terms of the engineering design process. We'll talk about what this means. If you are in POE, you should be writing some of this stuff down, and I'll tell you when to write stuff down. If you're in EDD, pay attention. You should probably also be writing this stuff down, but I'm not going to check. All right, so the agenda here, discussion of a design process. There will be a Canvas quiz on the design process for both classes. You can find information in PLTW, access that through Clever. And then we're going to design and build something using the design process. We're going to do that, obviously, the building in class. And so there will be a writing assignment for both classes, POE and EDD. This is I'm just letting you know that what you're going to end up doing is writing about how you apply the design process to the project that you're about to do, right? What parts of the process are more difficult or easier than others, and what you learn from applying that process. So this is a preview, so pay attention so you can access this information when you're writing your paper. So what is the engineering design process? It's basically a method for doing things in engineering. They're often represented by sort of a wheel like you see here. Sometimes it's a flow chart, but they all have sort of a process to them, a definite start, and then sometimes you have to go around the wheel a couple of times, you have to go around the flow chart a couple of times, but there's a bunch of different ways to represent it. We're going to use the PLTW engineering design process because that's the one that is the curriculum that we're using, and that's this sort of purple and blue one right here. And it starts by defining a problem, generating concepts, developing solutions, constructing and testing, evaluating, and then presenting that solution. And you can kind of see over here, most of these have similar things, learn, design, build, deploy, investigate, plan, create. They're all very similar. And you can use any of them you want whenever you get to be your own engineer or go to college or whatever. But it's just a way of thinking about things. So it's a methodical way of solving a problem by generating ideas, making experiments, learning things, and then trying it again. And most importantly, it's what's called an iterative process. Iterative process means that it's made like this wheel, right? You define the process, you generate concepts, you do something, and you might have to go around the wheel a couple times. Especially if it's a very complex project, you're going to have to define the problem, and then after you develop a solution or you construct and test or you're evaluating your solution, you might be like, oh, I got to redefine that problem. Or I might have to go back and develop a new solution after I've evaluated the first one. And that's what makes a good engineer, being able to go back and say, hey, I need to reevaluate this. I need to do this part again, right? So it's an iterative process. A lot of the projects that you've done in school are not an iterative process. You get a certain set of instructions and you do it and you do exactly what the teacher says, because I know you're all great students, and then you don't have to worry about it. But in engineering, we're going to do a lot of iterations, especially in this next project coming up. You're going to do one thing, it's not going to work. You're going to do something else, that may work, that may not work. You're going to do it again, right? So usually in engineering, we're going to go through more than one cycle of this iterative process. For those of you in POE, you see the notebook title down here, notebook title design process. That means something on here you should write down. I'm not going to tell you exactly what that is, but you should take some notes from this slide. All right, so the definitions and the screenshots here come from PLTW. You can access that through Clever. You should know how to do that. First thing is defining the problem. What's the problem you're solving and why are you solving it? If you don't know why you're solving a problem, it's really hard to solve it the right way. The official definitions, I'm not going to read through this. This is available on PLTW. If you want to pause the video here, it's a good spot so you can write some of this down. Right? Who says it's a problem? Why is it a problem? Who cares if it's a problem? These are the things you use to define the problem. Right? Prove that your that your problem is valid. Prove that you know what you're doing. Prove that you know what you're thinking about. I'm going to give you an example here. This is a bad example. I need a new coffee mug. That's not a good problem statement. I might need a new coffee mug, but it's not a good problem statement. Here's a better example. And this has things like according to News Direct. So it's got some stats in there. In order to gain the most enjoyment, it's got some information in there. It has some stats like keeping coffee at a temperature for 20 minutes. Again, you might want to pause the video and take a look at some of this and read through it. What do you not see here? So think about this for a second before you let it go on to the next part of the video. So what you don't see there is you don't see a proposed solution. Problem statements are not about proposing solutions. They're about identifying and defining the problem. So you define the problem. You don't say what the solution is. That's why it says a bad example. It says, I need a new coffee mug. It doesn't tell me why I need a new coffee mug. Problem statements are about telling me why I might need a new coffee mug. Tell me the problem, right? When you get to be a really good engineer, you don't want somebody coming to you and telling you what to build. You want them coming to you and telling you the problem. And then you get to do your engineering magic and tell them what you're going to build to solve their problem. That's more fun as an engineer, trust me. The next part is generating concepts, right? So this is the next one in the wheel. It's number 2 in the wheel. So how do you plan to solve this problem? This is also the fun part of engineering, right? You're brainstorming, you're deciding on ideas, you're thinking things out with your group. You're trying to figure out how I'm going to solve this problem. And again, this comes from PLTW. You might want to pause here and take a look at some of the information here. This is where you do your research. This is where you apply your STEM principles. You think about the math you're going to need to do this. You think about the sketching you're going to need to do it. You're doing your research, you're brainstorming with your team, you're doing these kind of things. Some of the ideas here might be drawing a sort of a rudimentary sketch about the thing that you want to solve, the thing that you want to do. You're going to do some research on websites or Google search. Be careful when you're doing a Google search. You may not get good information. Go to reputable sources to get good information. You could have brainstorming sessions, right? I think we should build blue shoes or whatever. I think we should have strings to tie them together. Whatever that is, generate some concepts about the things that you want to build. Right? And then you're developing a solution, right? This is when you take all those concepts, all those ideas, all that brainstorming, all that research, and you say, I think this is the solution to that problem, right? It may get you a small prototype. You might get closer to a solution. You might decide, oh, here's a thing that I'm going to try. Here's a thing that I think is a solution. Could be any of those things, right? But it's part of the iterative nature of this design process that you might have to stop here and really think about what you're doing, because you might have to come back here and you might have to go backward from step 3. This is kind of in the middle. You might have to go back to step 2 and step 1 and redefine your problem, right? So I'm pausing here to talk about the iterative nature of the design process, right? So here's where this is a good stopping point where you're developing a solution, right? If you can't justify the solution, then you might have to go back to and redefine the problem statement, right? If you can't develop a solution that you think is going to solve the problem, then you got to go back to the stakeholders and say, hey, is this really the problem you're having? Because the solution I'm coming up with doesn't really solve it, right? So this is a really important step. As an engineer, you're probably going to make a diagram. You're probably going to make a detailed description of your proposed solution so you can communicate that, right? Everybody's not an engineer. You need to communicate like an engineer. For my sophomores, this is what you're going to learn about in Mr. DeAnda's class. You're going to learn about how to make 3D CAD drawings. You're going to learn about how to write like an engineer. For my seniors, you better know how to do this already, right? You're communicating like an engineer. You're developing a solution to tell someone who doesn't know what this solution is, what the solution looks like, right? So very important step. And this is also the point where you sometimes go backward and sometimes go forward. And then everybody's favorite, construct and test. This is what everybody wants to start with, right? I want to build a lightsaber. I want to build this. I want to do that. I don't even know what the problem is, right? If you start here, you need to define the problem. You need to generate some concepts. You need to develop a solution. Now we construct. Now we build. And maybe you're just building a prototype, right? Maybe you're just building one part of the thing of the solution that you developed just to see if it works, right? We'll talk a lot about prototyping in EDD. We'll talk a little bit less about it in POE, but don't worry, we'll get there. This is where you start prototyping. This is where you start constructing. This is where you start building things. And this is the fun part, right? I get it. This is the fun part. But also, you sometimes need to go backward from here. You need to generate more concepts, define a new problem, something like that. So constructing and testing is where we want to get to. We want to build things because we're engineers. And then you need to evaluate what you built. Did that thing you build actually solve the problem? Right? If it's a well-defined problem, that'll be a yes or no answer, right? Did it solve it or did it not solve it? If it's not a well-defined problem, maybe you need to go back and redefine that problem, right? Maybe you solved a different problem, and that's okay too, but it's not the thing that you're getting paid to solve. So your company may not like that, right? But that happens a lot too. But let's evaluate it against the problem statement that was given. And maybe the problem statement needs to be rewritten, and maybe it's a different problem statement, and maybe it solved it really well. Who knows that? But you have to evaluate that, right? This is where you redesign if necessary. If your solution doesn't solve the problem, you got to redesign it. So you got to go back on the wheel, right? Redesigning the solution means going back to step 3, right? Just like this, develop a new solution, right? I need to redesign it. Maybe it's not a whole new solution. Maybe it's just another iterative prototype from where I was. Right, so after I've evaluated the solution, figured out if it's effective, I got to present it. This is where I tell my boss what I've done. This is where I tell my teacher what I've done. This is where I tell the stakeholders what I've done. This is where I present it to the world, right? Here's my new widget that solves this problem. And I present it, and then sometimes those people will come back to you and say, yeah, that was a good presentation, but you did not solve the problem, right? This is where you document. This is where you communicate. This is a very important step, and one that we sometimes miss out on in school, but not an EDD class. You guys are going to communicate and present a lot. So I know I went through that kind of quick. I was hoping to do a quick video. Shouldn't have taken you so long. Go back and watch it again if you need to. Make sure you do the play pause it questions, because that's how I'm going to be grading whether or not you've done this. So if you have questions about this, please ask me in class. I'm going to assume that you've all gone through this so that we understand it together in class, and so I don't have to go through all this information again. Thanks for listening. That's under 15 minutes.